The village breathes again summer had shifted to its gentler mood by the time the trial was over. The roses in Miss Marple's garden had begun their second flush, softer in color but sweeter in scent, and the swallows were gathering in earnest for their journey south. Marleycombe, after its weeks of breathless speculation, returned to something like normal. Mrs. Bellamy once more busied herself with her shop window displays, though she now spoke in a softer tone, as if wary of how words might be overheard. Mr. Reeves could be seen in the dairy yard, polishing his milk cart with the same care he might give a cathedral. Only occasionally did the villagers glance toward the Harcourt house, now shuttered and silent, with an air of having been emptied too quickly. Miss Marple tended her sweet peas one afternoon, when young Alice from the post office paused at the gate. "It's all rather strange, isn't it, Miss Marple? Mrs. Harcourt and all that business. You'd never have thought it of her." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One rarely does, my dear. Villages are like gardens. You may plant the prettiest flowers, but the weeds still come up if you're not watchful." Alice laughed then, realizing Miss Marple meant more than she'd said, made her farewells inside. The sitting room was as it had been before the whole affair began. Lace cloth on the table, knitting in its basket, tea things set neatly on the tray. The cash box, the ledger, the photographs, all were locked away in the police station. Their power to wound finally spent. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and took the first sip. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. Somewhere a cart rattled over the cobbles, and a dog barked twice before falling silent. Life in Marleycombe went on, as it always had, quietly, persistently, under the watchful eyes of those who understood that even the smallest things can hold the greatest truths. The truth in plain sight. Inspector Craddock had chosen the station's small meeting room for the gathering. Its plain walls and straight-backed chairs were not quite as cozy as a village parlor, but they served his purpose, to keep people uneasy. Seated in a semicircle were the key players: Mr. Reeves, Mrs. Bellamy, the two men arrested at the mill, and Mrs. Lydia Harcourt, pale and composed, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Miss Marple sat in the center, her knitting in her bag, her expression mild. Craddock began briskly. "We have recovered a ledger, several letters, and certain photographs from the mill. These items confirm a long-running blackmail scheme involving several members of this village and beyond." He nodded to Miss Marple. "Perhaps you'd explain, madam, how this connects to Paul Grant's death." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It was, I think, a matter of greed meeting desperation. The ledger shows Mr. Grant began as a victim, paying Lydia Harcourt to keep quiet about an indiscretion from his years abroad. But Mr. Grant was not content to remain a victim. He saw how profitable such a scheme could be, and in time he became a collector as well as a payer." Her eyes rested briefly on the two men from the mill. These gentlemen did the rough work, collecting money, storing it in the mill. But the instigator, the mind behind it all, remained Mrs. Harcourt. Mrs. Harcourt's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple went on, her voice still gentle. 3 months before his death, Mr. Grant decided he wanted the whole sum for himself. He stopped paying Mrs. Harcourt and began hinting he might tell the police about the operation. That note in the cash box, the one threatening him, was her last warning. She glanced at Craddock. He did not heed it. And so, one evening at the fete, when he left early, Mrs. Harcourt followed him home. She entered through the back. The servants had the night off, and they argued. A heavy candlestick was to hand, and in a moment of panic, she struck him. The blow was fatal. A faint sound escaped Mrs. Bellamy. A sharp intake of breath. Miss Marple's tone softened. She might still have escaped suspicion, had she not hidden that torn ledger page in the curtain hem, intending to remove it later. But such things are rarely overlooked for long. Craddock produced the burned fragments recovered from the mill last night. And when she realized we'd found the cash box, she tried to destroy the last of the evidence, which was where Miss Marple and I caught up with her." Mrs. Harcourt looked at Miss Marple for a long moment, then gave a small, tired nod. "Yes," she said quietly, "it's all true. He would have ruined me, so I ruined him first." The inspector signaled to the constable. As they led her away, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, hands folded neatly. "Such a pity," she murmured. "If only people realized that secrets are far more dangerous to keep than to confess." The midnight errand was nearly 11:30 when Miss Marple, in her dressing gown and slippers, settled by the window with her knitting. She had no intention of sleeping yet. The moon was full, the air still, and she knew from long acquaintance that guilty consciences often grew restless after a conversation such as the one at tea. Sure enough, a shadow moved along the hedge line opposite the gables. The tall, elegant figure of Mrs. Lydia Harcourt emerged, wrapped in a dark coat and carrying what looked like a small parcel. She glanced over her shoulder before hurrying toward the lane that led to the river. Miss Marple rose, slipped on her coat, and quietly let herself out the side door. The moonlight was strong enough to keep to the deeper shade of the garden walls and hedgerows as she followed. Mrs. Harcourt did not take the main path to the river. Instead, she turned sharply into a narrow, overgrown track that skirted the allotments. And joined the back way to the old mill. At the mill door, she crouched, fumbling with the latch. Then she vanished inside. Miss Marple waited a full minute before approaching, her footsteps silent on the damp grass. Through a gap in the rotting planks, she saw Mrs. Harcourt kneeling by the spot where the floorboards had been prized up 2 nights before. This time, there was no cash box. Instead, Mrs. Harcourt drew from her coat the small parcel, unwrapping it to reveal a bundle of letters and photographs. She struck a match, lit a candle stub, and set the papers alight. The flames curled the edges of the photographs, blackening faces and turning ink to ash. Miss Marple opened the door quietly, stepping inside. "I should be careful, my dear," she said gently. Smoke leaves such a distinctive scent on clothing, so difficult to explain if one has merely been in bed all evening. Mrs. Harcourt gasped, dropping the burning bundle. Miss Marple stamped it out with her shoe before the old boards could. Catched out in the silence that followed, Mrs. Harcourt's voice was low and bitter. "You think you know everything, don't you?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple replied. "I simply notice what other people prefer not to see. And I noticed that you could not quite meet my eye when I spoke of blackmail, because you are paying, as well as profiting." At that moment, Inspector Craddock appeared in the doorway. He had followed at Miss Marple's suggestion, though she had not told him precisely what they would find. Jam and gentle persuasion. The parlor at the Gables was at its best that afternoon. Lace cloth on the table, vases of sweet peas from the garden, and the comforting scent of freshly baked scones. Miss Marple had arranged her chairs in an unassuming circle, with the low table in the center, so no one felt they were at a formal gathering. The guests came, each with their own expression of polite curiosity. Inspector Craddock was there, ostensibly to enjoy a quiet village tea, though he kept mostly to the background. Mrs. Bellamy from the haberdashery arrived in her best hat. Mr. Reeves from the dairy carried a pot of clotted cream. And arriving last, Mrs. Lydia Harcourt, elegant in a pale green frock, her eyes flicking quickly around the room as though measuring escape routes. Miss Marple poured tea, spoke of the weather, and commented on the early blackberries. The conversation turned, as she knew it would, to village events, then to the fate, and at last to the unfortunate death of Mr. Paul Grant. "Dreadful business," Mrs. Bellamy sighed. "One never knows what goes on behind closed doors." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Indeed. I was just remarking to Inspector Craddock the other day. How curious it is that people sometimes keep things hidden for years, only for the smallest slip to bring them all to light. She spread jam on her scone, her voice mild. For example, in that little mill by the river, the one that's been empty for so long. One wonders how many people have been there over the years, perhaps to hide something, or to retrieve it. There was a faint clink. Mrs. Harcourt had set down her teaspoon a fraction too hard. Miss Marple looked at her with an expression of simple concern. "My dear, are you quite well? You've gone rather pale." Mrs. Harcourt recovered quickly, but her eyes flickered toward Craddock. It's just the heat, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled. "Of course. Though I do recall that Mr. Grant had a very good friend once who was quite devoted to him, until, that is, he learned something she would much rather have kept to herself, something that could ruin her if it became public." There was a silence in which only the ticking clock could be heard. Then Mrs. Harcourt spoke, her voice too brisk. "One hears all sorts of nonsense in a village. Best not to listen to gossip." Miss Marple folded her napkin, her eyes twinkling just a little. "Quite so. But I find, Mrs. Harcourt, that gossip, like jam, tends to stick to one's fingers, however much one tries to wipe it away." Craddock caught her meaning. The tension in the room had shifted. The other guests sensed it too, though none understood the whole of it. Miss Marple had not accused, merely nudged, and in doing so had seen the first crack appear in the facade. The ledger of shadows Inspector Craddock brought the cash box to the small interview room at the Marleycombe station. It was a plain iron thing, scratched and pitted from age, with a lock that yielded easily to the station sergeant's key ring. Inside lay 3 neat bundles of banknotes, each wrapped in paper and marked with dates. Beneath them was a packet of letters tied with string, a handful of photographs, and a small ledger, the same size and paper as the torn account page Miss Marple had found in the curtain. Craddock spread the contents on the table. "Well, this is interesting." The ledger contained a series of entries spanning nearly 10 years. Each page named a person, followed by amounts paid at irregular intervals. Some names were villagers: Mr. Reeves of the dairy, Mrs. Bellamy who ran the haberdashery, while others were from nearby towns. Each sum was large enough to suggest desperation rather than generosity. Miss Marple leafed through with delicate fingers. "And here," she said, tapping a page midway through, "is where Mr. Paul Grant first appears, 4 years ago. The payments to him ceased suddenly 3 months before his death." The letters were worse. Each was a blunt demand for money, threatening to expose an affair, a theft, or some other indiscretion. The handwriting varied, suggesting more than one. Blackmailer had been involved over the years. One envelope caught Miss Marple's eye. It was addressed to P. Grant, but bore no stamp, only a smudged fingerprint in the corner. Inside was a single sentence: "You've had your share. Now keep silent, or you'll be silenced." She looked at Craddock. "This," she said, "was written, not by our 2 friends from the mill, but by someone far closer to Mr. Grant, someone who had the most to lose if the whole edifice collapsed." Craddock leaned back. "And you know who that is?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I have my suspicions, but I think I should like to invite everyone concerned to tea tomorrow. It's remarkable what people will let slip when they think the conversation is about jam." Secrets in the floorboards. The next evening was cool and still, the kind of weather that made the willows hang lower over the river, their reflections wavering faintly in the water. Inspector Craddock met Miss Marple at the Gables promptly at 7. He was used to her understated manner, but tonight she seemed even more composed than usual, as though every detail had already played out in her mind. They walked along the green, past the allotments, and took the river path. "We shall keep to the trees," Miss Marple murmured, "and be patient. From their shadowed place near the orchard fence, they saw him arrive. The man in the cap came along the lane in a hurried, almost furtive walk, glancing from side to side. A second man followed at a distance, shorter, broader, with a hat pulled low. Two of them, Craddock muttered. Miss Marple nodded. Blackmail often makes an untidy partnership. The men slipped into the mill through the same broken door Miss Marple had used. Inside, faint lamplight flickered through the cracked shutters. Craddock moved closer, stepping carefully over the moss-slick stones. Through a gap in the wood, they saw the man in the cap kneeling on the floor, prizing up a warped board. Beneath it lay a metal cash box. He handed it to the other man, who opened it just enough to check the contents, papers, and what looked like several bundles of banknotes. Craddock stepped forward. "That's far enough, gentlemen." The taller man bolted for the side door, but found Miss Marple standing there, umbrella in hand. She did not move, nor did she speak, but something in her calm, unblinking gaze made him hesitate long enough for Craddock to seize his arm. The cash box was taken, its papers secured. Miss Marple, glancing briefly inside, noted that the account page she had forged was among them, folded neatly as if it were the most valuable item. As the inspector led the men away, he said quietly to her, "I suppose you already know what's in here?" "Not entirely," she replied, "but I have an excellent idea. And if I am correct, the contents will tell us not only who was being blackmailed, but who killed Paul Grant to keep the game going." Following the wrong trail, Miss Marple waited 2 days before she saw any movement. It came on a gray, drizzling morning when most of Marleycombe preferred to stay indoors. From her seat by the parlor window, she spotted the man in the cap walking briskly toward the old mill lane. He carried a folded newspaper under one arm and glanced over his shoulder twice before disappearing from sight. Miss Marple slipped on her mackintosh, took her umbrella, and set out, not in direct pursuit, but by the back path through Mrs. Larkin's orchard, which curved around to join the lane near the river bend. By the time she reached the point where the willows drooped low over the path, she could see him ahead. He had stopped beside the old mill, now a sagging ruin with ivy choking its windows. From the newspaper, he withdrew the false account page, her forgery, and compared it to something from his own pocket. Miss Marple kept to the trees, watching as he entered the mill through a broken side door. She gave him 5 minutes, then approached quietly. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of rotting wood. She could hear him moving above on the creaking upper floor. There was a scrape of something heavy being shifted, then the dull clink of metal on metal. Miss Marple retreated before he could come down, making her way to the lane just in time to see him leave. His step quicker now, the newspaper gone. Whatever he had hidden, he believed the paper had confirmed its safety. That afternoon, she sent a note, ostensibly an invitation to tea, to Inspector Craddock, hinting that a certain storehouse of secrets might be worth his attention. She did not mention the mill by name, only that they should walk together by the river the following evening. As she sealed the envelope, she thought with quiet satisfaction, "He will go back there before long. And if I am not mistaken, he will not be alone when he does." The false pocket that night, Miss Marple took out her knitting bag and, from its smallest inner compartment, removed the folded account page. She studied it for a moment in the lamplight, then opened a drawer in her writing desk and drew out a sheet of blank paper. With her neat, practiced hand, she copied the list, omitting 2 of the names and altering several figures. She underlined P. Grant exactly as it had been on the original, and then, to the untrained eye, the forgery looked convincingly aged. The real paper she slipped between the pages of her gardening diary once more. The false one she tucked into the inside pocket of her coat, a pocket loose enough to gape slightly if the coat were hung in a certain careless way. The next morning, she made sure to be seen in the village wearing that coat, even in the mild weather. At the draper's, she asked after buttons. At the post office, she inquired about stamps, always with the coat draped over her arm, just enough for the inner pocket to be visible about by noon. She felt certain the man in the cap had taken notice. She caught sight of him once, at the far end of the lane, leaning against the fence post, and again, reflected in the glass of the baker's door. That afternoon, she took tea in the garden with Clarissa, the coat hanging on the back of her chair. They chatted about roses and caterpillars, though Miss Marple's ear was tuned for the faintest sound from the open side gate. It came at last, the near-silent click of the latch, the brush of a sleeve against the privet hedge. Miss Marple sipped her tea, keeping her gaze on Clarissa, while the shadow of a tall figure moved along the edge of the garden. A moment later, there was the lightest tug at the coat, a rustle of fabric, and then the faintest retreating footstep. Clarissa went indoors to fetch more biscuits. Miss Marple reached into the coat's inner pocket. It was empty. She allowed herself the smallest, most satisfied smile. "Now," she murmured, "let's see what you do with a little poisoned bread." The price of silence, the station at Marleycombe, was a modest affair. A single platform, a waiting room with a pot-bellied stove, and the ever-reliable Mr. Trelawney, who had kept the trains and timetables in order for more than 2 decades. Miss Marple found him polishing the brass bell by the ticket window. "Mr. Trelawney," she began, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's memory. Do you recall when Mr. Paul Grant last traveled up to London?" Trelawney's brow furrowed in thought. "That would have been, let me see, the Tuesday before the fete. Early train, 8:12. He wasn't alone. There was a chap with him. Tall, lean, cap pulled down. Didn't seem like they were together at first, but when they boarded, the fellow sat right behind Mr. Grant. Did you know him?" "Never seen him before," Trelawney said. "But he came back that same night, without Mr. Grant. Got off the late train, didn't speak to a soul. Walked straight down toward the mill lane." Miss Marple thanked him and made her way back through the village, her mind quietly ordering the facts. The account page, the underlined P. Grant, the man in the cap returning alone. It suggested not only knowledge, but perhaps possession, of something Mr. Grant had intended to deliver in London. By the time she reached the Gables, Clarissa was waiting in the sitting room with an open newspaper. "Another note about the murder," she said. "The police say they've a new lead." Miss Marple read the small column without comment. The new lead was almost certainly the wrong one, a petty thief from the next village. But it was enough to distract public attention. As she handed the paper back, she noticed the lace curtain shift at the far edge of the window. Outside, just beyond the garden wall, stood the man in the cap. He was not watching the house so much as measuring it, eyes moving from window to door, from hedge to gate. Miss Marple moved to the tea-table with unhurried grace, though her mind was already calculating. He knew she had something. The question was whether he would try to take it quietly, or remove her entirely. She poured herself a cup of tea, stirred in a lump of sugar, and thought, it's time he saw what he expects to find, and learned it's not quite in his grasp. The Hems whisper that evening. Miss Marple asked Clarissa Harcourt if she might visit the vicarage the following morning to see about the flowers in the north transept. Clarissa, accustomed to her friend's mild excuses, raised no objection. Next day, Miss Marple arrived with her gardening gloves tucked neatly in her basket, but once in the vicarage drawing-room, her attention drifted, quite innocently, toward the tall side window and its heavy curtains. They were the same faded damask she remembered from years past, and Mrs. Holloway's beige thread matched them to perfection. With no one else in the room, the vicar had gone to fetch a hymn book. Miss Marple allowed her fingers to travel lightly along the inner seam of the left-hand curtain. Near the hem, she felt a slight irregularity beneath the stitching. Years of mending children's stockings and altering hems for the church fete had made her quick and neat. She drew out her small sewing scissors, snipped 2 discreet stitches, and eased open the narrow gap. A folded piece of paper slid into her gloved palm. She slipped it into her knitting bag just as the vicar returned, and resumed examining the flower arrangement as if nothing had occurred. Back at the Gables, she sat at her writing desk and unfolded the paper dot. It was not a letter in the usual sense, but a page torn from an account book, a list of names and figures, each marked with dates. The handwriting was small but clear, the ink a sharp, unfaded black. Several of the names were local: Bellamy, Holloway, Reeves. Others were unfamiliar. The amounts varied, but all were neatly totaled at the bottom, and it was not a small sum. One name, however, was underlined twice: P. Grant. Miss Marple. Read it through twice more before refolding it and placing it between the pages of her gardening diary. This was not yet proof of murder, but it was, she felt certain, the reason for it. Someone had hidden this list in the curtain hem, not to lose it, but to keep it safe until it could be retrieved. And the man with the cap had either hidden it himself, or was desperate to ensure no one else ever saw it. She glanced at her watch. There was still time before tea, enough to pay a certain visit to the station master, who might remember when Paul Grant last traveled, and perhaps who had been watching from the shadows when he did. A basket of bait the next morning, Miss Marple sat at the writing desk in the Gables' small sitting room, composing a brief note in her neat, looping hand. Dear Mrs. Holloway, I wonder if you might spare a small swatch of that beige thread we discussed. I have a friend who believes it may match an old curtain in her own possession. I will send my housemaid to collect it this afternoon. Yours sincerely, J. Marple. The housemaid, of course, was entirely imaginary. The point was to let certain ears, the sort that strained to overhear in the village, catch wind of her errand by mid-morning. She took herself to the draper's under the pretext of buying lace trim, making sure to mention to Mrs. Holloway, in a voice pitched just above casual, that she would be sending someone for the thread later. The draper's shop, like the post office, was a natural hub for passing talk. Miss Marple noted the presence of a stooped woman choosing buttons in the corner, Mrs. Pratt, the baker's sister, whose talent for repeating tidbits was unmatched. She also saw, reflected in the shop's glass door, a tall, wiry figure loitering by the lamppost outside at 3 o'clock. Clarissa Harcourt obligingly sent Miss Marple's non-existent maid, in reality, young Michael Reeves, given the errand as a special favor, to fetch the thread. Michael had been instructed to take the long route home, passing by the green and the old mill lane before returning. Miss Marple, knitting by the parlor window, waited. Michael returned within the hour, looking pleased with himself. He followed. Me, just like you thought, he reported. Kept back a ways, but I saw him in the shop window when I stopped for lemonade. Then, after I turned off the green, he went the other way. And did he see you receive the thread? Oh, yes. I made sure Mrs. Holloway gave it to me right in the doorway. Miss Marple took the small paper packet from him. Inside was this familiar pale beige thread, and, to her satisfaction, the knowledge that the man's interest in it was not accidental. He's wondering, she murmured, almost to herself, whether I found what he hid, or what he thought no one would ever find. The man who noticed it was market day in Marleycombe, which meant the square was a bustle of stalls, wagons, and clattering voices. Miss Marple, with her shopping basket looped neatly over her arm, moved among the crowd in her usual unhurried way. She had no real need for apples or seed packets this morning. Her purpose lay in faces, not wares. Michael Reeves's description, tall, wiry, with a cap, had been circling her mind like a knitting pattern that wouldn't quite resolve. She was determined to see whether such a figure would appear again among the ordinary routines of the village. Near the poultry stall, she caught sight of him. He was just as Michael had described, lean, weather-beaten, the sort of man who might pass easily for a tradesman or laborer. His cap shaded his eyes, but Miss Marple noticed the quick, appraising glance he gave her as she paused to adjust her basket. He looked away at once, a little too quickly, and drifted toward the edge of the market. Miss Marple allowed him to go, then quietly followed, keeping to the shade of the shop fronts. The man did not linger. He cut across the green, past the lich gate, and down toward the narrow lane leading to the old mill. It was there, by the leaning fence, that something subtle shifted. A man stopped, lit a cigarette, and without turning, said over his shoulder, "You'd be wise, madam, to mind your own affairs." The words were quiet, but they carried the unmistakable weight of a warning. Miss Marple, who had halted a good 6 paces away, smiled pleasantly as though she'd misheard. "Oh, I always try to, you know. Though in a village, one's affairs do seem to overlap." He flicked his cigarette into the grass, stepped into the shadow of the trees, and was gone. She did not pursue him. Instead, she walked back toward the square at the same unhurried pace as before. But under her calm exterior, she was cataloguing the exchange, the deliberate approach to the old mill, the hint of threat in his voice, and the unmistakable fact that he had recognized her interest. Back at the Gables, she removed the tiny scrap of thread from her knitting bag once again and laid it on the table. It felt suddenly heavier than it was, as though it carried the weight of something yet. Unseen. He knows I've noticed him, she thought. That will make him either careless or dangerous. Following the stitch, Miss Marple began her morning at the post office, a place where the day's letters and the day's gossip shared equal priority. Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, greeted her warmly and inquired after Clarissa's health. Between pleasantries, Miss Marple casually asked, "I wonder if you've had any unfamiliar visitors lately? Tall gentlemen, perhaps, wearing caps?" Mrs. Finch pursed her lips. "Now you mention it, last Thursday afternoon, a man I didn't know came in to send a registered parcel. Addressed to London, quite a smart part, too. He paid in cash. Didn't say much, but I remember thinking his hands were rough, like he worked with tools, and he kept glancing at the clock. Would you happen to recall his name? Afraid not. He didn't offer it, and I didn't ask." From the post office, Miss Marple walked to Bellamy's bakery. Cedric Bellamy was fetching loaves from the oven when she entered. "Mr. Bellamy," she said, "do you recall doing any repair work for Mrs. Grant recently?" "Not lately," Bellamy said, "though about a month back a chap came in here asking if I'd got spare lengths of upholstery thread. Strong stuff, he said. I didn't have any, so I sent him to the draper's. Don't know his name, but he was tall, wiry. Wore a cap. Odd fellow." The draper's shop provided the final stitch in the pattern. Mrs. Holloway, the owner, remembered the man, too. Yes, he bought some thick thread, pale beige. Said it was to reinforce a hem. I thought it strange, him knowing exactly what shade to ask for. Matched those old vicarage curtains perfectly. Miss Marple smiled politely, but inside her thoughts quickened. This tall man had not only been watching the vicarage, he had obtained thread to match its curtains. And from what Mrs. Holloway described, he had done so well before the murder, suggesting preparation rather than impulse. That evening, as the lamplight pooled on the table at the Gables, Miss Marple took out the tiny scrap of thread she had found by the churchyard wall. Comparing it to the fresh piece Mrs. Holloway had wrapped for her, to be sure of the shade, she found the match exact. She said nothing to Clarissa, only tucked the threads back into her knitting bag. She had learned. Over many years, that there was a particular moment when a clue changed from interesting to dangerous. This was one of those moments. The man by the wall the following morning, Marley Cone, was bathed in sunlight, though the mood of its inhabitants remained clouded. Miss Trent was still being held for further questioning, and most villagers were treating this as proof of her guilt. Most, but not Miss Marple. Clarissa Harcourt had gone to call on a friend, leaving Miss Marple free to wander the village without polite obligations. She took the long route from the gables to the churchyard, a path that skirted the stone wall at the far end of the green. Halfway along, she stopped. The wall here faced the vicarage's side garden, the very spot where Mrs. Crowther had seen Paul Grant entering on the day of the murder. The path was quiet now, but Miss Marple noticed something she had not before, a patch of disturbed earth near the wall's base, as if someone had crouched there recently. She bent slightly, peering closer. Embedded in the soft soil was a tiny scrap of pale thread, finer than the heavy curtain material, but caught in a way that suggested it had once been part of a stitch. She extracted it delicately and tucked it into her handkerchief. She was still considering this find when she heard a voice behind her. "Looking for something, Miss Marple?" It was young Michael Reeves, the errand boy from the post office, a thin, watchful lad with a knack for appearing where interesting things happened. "Not exactly," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "though you do seem to be out and about at unusual times yourself." Michael shuffled his feet, but she saw the flicker of calculation in his eyes. "I was here the other day, when the police were at the vicarage. Saw a man standing right there by the wall. Not the nephew. Taller. Had a cap pulled low. I thought he was just a passer-by, but he didn't move on. Kept glancing toward the window." "What time was this?" Miss Marple asked, her voice still mild. Michael screwed up his face and thought, "Must have been just before one. I remember, 'cause I was on my way to deliver the post to the station." "And you didn't mention this to the police?" The boy shrugged. "Didn't seem important. Everyone was saying it was the nephew, weren't they?" Miss Marple walked on, her mind quietly sorting through this new piece of information. A man by the wall, just before the estimated time of death. Someone watching the house, and perhaps waiting for the moment when the curtains were drawn. It fitted with something she had suspected from the start, that the murder was not a crime of sudden passion, but one of careful timing. She glanced at the tiny thread still hidden in her handkerchief and thought, perhaps it is time to follow the stitch rather than the scissors. The companion in question, Inspector Cray, arrived at the Gables just before luncheon, looking brisk and, to Miss Marple's mind, a shade too satisfied. "We've located Miss Trent," he announced to Clarissa Harcourt in the hallway. "She's been staying with a cousin in Crowthorne. Left the village the night before the fete, without telling Mrs. Grant. Not exactly the action of an innocent woman, wouldn't you say?" Clarissa raised her brows. "And why did she leave?" Cray's expression suggested he was already writing the ending to this story. "Says she was unwell. But we've also learned she recently withdrew a large sum from her bank account. And when we searched her cousin's house, we found heavy-duty sewing scissors and thread that matched the curtains in the vicarage drawing room." Clarissa gave a low whistle. "That does sound damning." Miss Marple had been listening from her chair in the drawing room. She looked up now, her expression mild. "And what, Inspector, does Miss Trent say about this thread and these scissors?" "Claims they were for mending an old quilt." Miss Marple allowed the faintest of smiles. "I believe I have heard that before." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the police station under the pretext of delivering a message from Clarissa to the vicar's wife, who happened to be visiting there. In truth, she wanted to see Miss Trent for herself. The companion was seated in a small interview room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was a spare, neatly dressed woman in her 50s, with anxious eyes. "I didn't kill her, Miss Marple," she said almost before the older woman had sat down. "She could be difficult, yes, but she was my life, really. She gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "And the curtains?" Miss Trent sighed. "It's true. I stitched the hem last week. She asked me to. Said the edge was coming undone. I didn't notice anything unusual inside. I swear it. I was only there for a few minutes before she went into the kitchen. Then I left to fetch something from the shops." Miss Marple regarded her with quiet interest. "Did she often send you out on errands at inconvenient times?" "Frequently," Miss Trent said, almost with a small, fond smile. "She liked to do things in her own way, without anyone watching. If she thought I was hovering, she'd find a reason to send me off." That night, back at the Gables, Miss Marple considered the woman's words. If Miss Trent had removed something from the curtain hem, she had had every chance to hide it before leaving the house. But something about her manner, the frankness of her anxiety, did not ring false. The evidence against her had been gathered with remarkable speed. Too remarkable. Miss Marple threaded her needle and thought, a very good frame is sometimes easier to spot than a very bad alibi. Those who might have known by mid-morning the lanes of Marleycombe were drying under a brisk breeze. Miss Marple, wearing her neat navy coat and carrying her umbrella more as a walking stick than a necessity, made her way from the Gables to the cluster of cottages near the church. She had decided, in her quiet way, to answer a single question. Who might have known there was something hidden in the hem of Mrs. Grant's curtains? Her first stop was the home of Mrs. Emily Prowse, the vicarage's occasional charwoman. Mrs. Prowse was a wiry woman with quick eyes, who opened her door still in her apron. "Oh, those curtains," Mrs. Prowse said, shaking her head. "Dusty as anything. I've brushed them down often enough, but never meddled with the hems. Mrs. Grant liked to keep her things just so. Wouldn't have thanked me for poking about." Though she hesitated, clearly enjoying the suspense. "Oh, last Thursday. I did see her companion, Miss Trent, with her sewing-box out in the drawing-room. She was sitting right by the curtains, too." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was mild. "Did she seem to be mending them?" Mrs. Prowse sniffed. "Couldn't say. She had the look of a cat that's been in the cream. You know, pleased with herself. That one was always a bit sly, if you ask me." From there, Miss Marple walked on to Mrs. Parsons at the greengrocer's, ostensibly to buy apples, but in truth to test another angle. "Curtains?" Mrs. Parsons repeated. "Well, Miss Trent ordered some heavy thread from me a few weeks back. Said she was patching an old quilt. But I thought it odd, because it was the same shade as those drawing-room drapes." Miss Marple thanked her, paid for the apples, and left, her mind quietly filing this away. The day's final call was to the cottage of Mr. Cedric Bellamy, the baker's son and an amateur carpenter who often took odd repair jobs about the village. He was sanding a small table in the garden when Miss Marple arrived. "Oh, those curtains," Bellamy said when she brought them up. "Mrs. Grant once asked me if I knew how to take out a hem without damaging the cloth. Said she was thinking of altering the fall of them, whatever that meant. This was 3 weeks ago, maybe? But then she never mentioned it again." By the time Miss Marple returned to the Gables, she had 3 separate references to those curtain hems, all pointing in some way toward Miss Trent. It was tempting, almost too tempting, to picture the reserved, absent companion carefully unpicking the stitches, extracting some hidden object, and sewing it closed again. But as she sat in Clarissa's drawing-room, the afternoon light slanting in across her knitting, Miss Marple felt the first faint tug of doubt. It was all too neat, the sort of neatness that makes one suspicious. She murmured to herself, "I have been given this answer far too easily." The hem and the needle by the following morning. The rain had passed. leaving Marleycombe washed and bright, as though the village had been scrubbed overnight. But inside the Gables breakfast room, there was still a lingering heaviness. Clarissa Harcourt sipped her coffee, glancing at Miss Marple over the rim of the cup. "You're thinking about what Daniel Frobisher said," she remarked. Miss Marple buttered her toast with the air of one admitting nothing and everything at once. "It is curious," she said mildly, "that his first conscious word should be hem. And that only yesterday Mrs. Grant herself was observed attending to the hem of her curtains." Clarissa gave a small shrug. "It could be coincidence." "My dear Clarissa," Miss Marple replied, "coincidences are a great deal rarer than people suppose, particularly in matters involving death." She finished her toast and announced her intention to take a walk. In truth, she was going to the vicarage. The house stood silent behind its low stone wall, the gate tied shut with police tape. Inspector Cray had reluctantly agreed to let Miss Marple look in, under supervision, provided she did not disturb anything. The drawing-room was dim despite the sunshine outside. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, just as she had imagined them when she first heard the news. Cray opened them grudgingly, letting in a flood of light that revealed dust motes dancing in the air. Miss Marple's eyes went at once to the left-hand curtain. She bent over slightly, adjusting her spectacles, and ran her fingers along the hem. The stitching here was old, and even the sort one might expect from a professional upholsterer decades ago. The right-hand curtain, however, was different. Its hem had been restitched in one small section, the thread newer, paler. The stitches themselves were smaller and uneven, as if done in haste, not badly, but by someone accustomed to sewing clothing rather than heavy drapery. "You see?" she murmured. Cray frowned. "Could have been repaired." "Possibly. But Mrs. Grant was an accomplished needlewoman, was she not?" He looked blank. "I wouldn't know." "I would," Miss Marple said serenely. "One can tell from the evenness of the older work that she was quite precise. This little section here, perhaps it was opened and then sewn shut again very recently. I would be most interested to know what was once inside." Cray muttered something about getting the police seamstress to examine it before they left. Miss Marple let her gaze wander over the rest of the room. On the small side table beside the armchair where Mrs. Grant had been found, there was an empty envelope. She noted the faint square mark on its surface, the kind left when something stiff has been enclosed. Back outside, she drew a deep breath of the fresh air. She had no proof yet, but she was beginning to suspect that whatever lay in that curtain, hem had been the key to this entire affair, and that someone had been willing to kill twice to obtain it. The second shock, the rain, came without warning that evening, a sudden summer downpour that drove most of Marleycombe indoors, rattling on slate roofs and pattering against window panes. At the Gables, Clarissa Harcourt had drawn the curtains in the drawing-room and was settling in with a novel when the telephone rang. Miss Marple, seated nearby with her knitting, listened as Clarissa answered. There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "What? Oh, I see. Yes, of course, I'll come at once." She hung up, her hand trembling slightly. "Jane, that was Mrs. Parsons from the greengrocer's. She says Daniel Frobisher's cottage has been broken into. And he's been attacked." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Attacked? Is he badly hurt?" "Unconscious, apparently. They've sent for the doctor. She says there was a terrible mess. Drawers pulled out, papers scattered everywhere." Within 10 minutes, Clarissa's motor car was splashing through the puddled lanes toward the far end of the village. The cottage stood half hidden behind, a tangle of roses gone wild, its front door wide open. A small knot of neighbors stood outside in the rain, murmuring in low voices. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp earth and spilt ink. Daniel Frobisher lay on the sofa, pale and motionless, with a wet cloth pressed to his forehead. Dr. Penrose was bending over him, while Inspector Cray stood by the hearth, looking grim. "Nothing to be alarmed about," the doctor said to Clarissa's anxious questions. "A blow to the head. Nasty, but not fatal. He'll wake soon enough." Cray's eyes moved to Miss Marple. "It looks like a burglary gone wrong. Someone was searching for something, quite methodically, I might add. Only stopped when Frobisher came home unexpectedly." Miss Marple glanced around the room. The disorder was indeed thorough. Papers from the desk strewn across the carpet, a drawer appended onto a chair, books pulled halfway from their shelves. But it was the desk itself that caught her eye. One of the drawers, lying open on the floor, had a lining of faded floral fabric, the kind once used for curtains. Along the edge, she could see a neat hand-stitched hem. "Inspector," she said quietly, "does it not strike you as curious that the lining of this drawer is curtain?" "Material?" Cray frowned. "Can't say I'd noticed." Miss Marple nodded toward the fabric. "A thrifty reuse, perhaps. Or a reminder that such hems can conceal things very neatly indeed." Cray's expression grew guarded. "You still think this curtain business is relevant?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that it is very seldom curtains are drawn and redrawn without reason." At that moment, Daniel Frobisher stirred, moaning softly. The doctor bent over him. "Frobisher, it's Penrose." "Can you hear me?" Frobisher's eyes opened a fraction. He whispered. Before closing them again, Miss Marple's glance met the inspector's. The rain battered harder at the windows, but in the room there was a stillness, the kind that falls when everyone realizes they have just heard something very important indeed. Old wounds in Marleycombe, mid-afternoon. The village had settled into a peculiar rhythm, outwardly calm, yet with an undercurrent of restless curiosity. Shopkeepers leaned over counters to exchange whispered theories with customers. Neighbors lingered at garden gates longer than necessary, lowering their voices whenever footsteps approached. Miss Marple, carrying a neat string bag of shopping, made her way along the high street. She had already paid polite calls on the greengrocer, the baker, and the ironmonger, and in each place she had asked after Mrs. Elspeth Grant in the mild, apparently aimless manner that had proved so useful over the years. It was at the greengrocer's that she had first heard the name Daniel Frobisher used to court her. Years ago, Mrs. Parsons, the greengrocer's wife, had confided while weighing out potatoes. But she broke it off, some say quite heartlessly. He left the village for London, came back about 2 years ago, after his wife died, took a cottage by the lane. I've seen him going to the vicarage once or twice, but she wasn't very welcoming. At the baker's, the conversation had taken another turn. Miss Trent, the companion, she's been with Mrs. Grant for years, Mr. Bellamy said, slicing bread with precise strokes. But she was thinking of leaving. Sighed she couldn't stand the atmosphere any longer. Odd thing, though, she's nowhere to be seen since yesterday, not even at the fete. I'd have thought she'd be in floods of tears, even the circumstances. The ironmonger, a wiry man with a sharp nose, had supplied yet another thread. You know her brother left her the vicarage, but not the rest of his estate. That went to a charity for missionary work. Mrs. Grant wasn't best pleased, I can tell you. Still, she had her own income, though some say she invested in something risky last year. Could be she was in trouble. Miss Marple had listened to all of this without pressing, her mild questions disguised as polite conversation. Now, as she stepped into the tea shop for a quiet cup, she sifted through what she had learned. 3 things stood out: the return of an old suitor, possibly unwelcome; a long-serving companion suddenly absent; a possible financial difficulty. Any of these might stir up trouble in a small village. Combined, they could create the sort of tension in which violence might flourish. Her thoughts were interrupted when Mrs. Crowther, the same Mrs. Crowther who had seen Paul Grant enter the vicarage, bustled into the tea shop. Spotting Miss Marple, she came over at once. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Crowther said, lowering her voice. "That business about the curtains. I did notice something odd when I looked over from my window. At about 12:15, the curtains were open. Wide open. But when the police came, closed." Miss Marple looked up sharply, though her tone remained mild. "And you are quite sure of the time?" "Oh, yes. I just set the pudding in the oven." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is most interesting, Mrs. Crowther. Most interesting indeed." When Mrs. Crowther had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long moment, stirring her tea, though she had already added sugar. Curtains open, then closed. It was a small thing, but in her long experience, such small changes often meant the difference between truth and deception. The arrest of Paul Grant the next morning dawned bright and deceptively peaceful, with the sunlight spilling across Marleycone's neat gardens as if nothing unpleasant had happened the day before. Yet beneath the surface, the village's calm was as fragile as the thin crust on a cooling pie, easily cracked to reveal something far less palatable dot at the gables. Miss Marple took her tea by the window, while Clarissa read aloud the front page of the Marleycone Gazette, her voice thick with disapproval. "Local woman murdered nephew held for questioning. Police are investigating the death of Mrs. Elspeth Grant, 68, found strangled in her home yesterday afternoon. Inspector Gerald Cray of Marleycone Police confirmed that a man is assisting with inquiries. Sources close to the investigation identify the man as the victim's nephew, Mr. Paul Grant. They've practically hanged him already," Clarissa said, folding the paper with unnecessary force. "And all on the basis of a quarrel and a few fingerprints." Miss Marple reached for a piece of toast. "I suppose the quarrel was heard by someone?" Clarissa nodded. "The postman. He said they were shouting about money as he came up the path. Of course, that's all anyone needs to hear to make up their minds." Shortly after breakfast, Inspector Cray himself arrived, his boots leaving faint marks on the polished hall floor. Clarissa received him frostily, but Miss Marple, seated quietly in the drawing-room, looked up with a pleasant nod. "I thought you might wish to be informed," Cray said, "that Paul Grant has been taken into custody. The evidence is frankly conclusive." Miss Marple folded her hands. "I see. And what is the nature of this conclusive evidence, if I may ask?" Cray obliged. "He was seen entering the vicarage at 12 o'clock by Mrs. Crowther, who lives opposite. He admits he quarreled with his aunt. His fingerprints are on the teacup and the back of the chair where she was found. No sign of forced entry. The time of death, roughly between 12:30 and 1, fits perfectly." "Perfectly," Miss Marple repeated softly, as if turning the word over in her mind. The inspector added, "And when we searched his flat, we found an envelope containing a large sum of cash, several £100. He claims it's from the sale of his motorbike." "We'll be checking that story." Clarissa gave a short, derisive laugh. Motorbike, indeed. But Miss Marple's mind had caught on something else entirely. "And the curtains?" she asked. Cray blinked. "The curtains? In the drawing-room. Were they open when you found her?" "No, closed," Cray said, clearly puzzled. "Heavy velvet things. Blocked most of the light." Miss Marple only murmured, "Ah," and reached for her knitting bag. Her needles clicked softly, the only sound in the room for a moment. When the inspector had gone, Clarissa turned on her. "Jane, you can't possibly think Paul guilty?" Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "I think," she said slowly, "that the evidence is most inconveniently perfect. And in my experience, when everything appears to fit together without the slightest difficulty, one ought to look very carefully for the missing piece." Her gaze drifted to the window, where the sunlight touched the folds of the lace curtains. Curtains, hems, concealment. The thought refused to leave her. A visit to the Gables, the fete, wound down more quickly than usual that year. The brass ensemble packed away their instruments with an air of defeat, and the last of the trestle tables were dismantled under a sky that seemed suddenly overcast. Though not a cloud had truly appeared, Miss Marple accompanied Clarissa Harcourt back to the Gables. The house, with its tall sash windows and ivy climbing up one side, stood far enough from the green to feel apart from the village's immediate bustle, yet close enough for the sound of voices to drift faintly through the hedgerows. Clarissa, still full of outrage, ushered Miss Marple into the drawing-room. I told Inspector Cray that I simply could not imagine Paul doing such a thing, she said, removing her gloves with short, angry tugs. Though between ourselves, he is a most exasperating young man, far too fond of fast cars and fast company. Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered armchair. And what did the inspector say? That such young men are perfectly capable of terrible things if they think they can gain by them. Clarissa tossed her gloves onto a side table. He wouldn't listen to reason. Side Paul was seen entering the vicarage at noon, and had no satisfactory explanation for leaving just after 1 o'clock. As if that were proof of anything. Miss Marple's gaze moved about the room, noting the comfortable disorder, the vase of slightly wilting roses, the jumble of books on the sideboard. I suppose the vicarage is much as it was when her brother lived? Clarissa hesitated. In some ways, yes. Elspeth never cared to modernize much. Still the same dreadful, heavy drapes in the drawing-room. She claimed they kept the room cool in summer. Said Miss Marple. And yet, today she was fiddling with the hem of one of them, you said? Yes. At the fete yesterday morning, I ran into her in the grocer's, and she mentioned she'd found something odd in the curtain hem while dusting. Wouldn't say what. Just laughed, in that dry way she had, and changed the subject. Now I think of it, she seemed unsettled. Miss Marple's knitting bag sat by her chair, but she made no move to take it up. Her eyes were thoughtful. A curious thing to remark upon. Before Clarissa could reply, there came a knock at the door. The maid entered, her expression nervous. Beg pardon, madam. Inspector Cray is here. Says he'd like a word with both of you, if you don't. Mind, Clarissa bristled. Well, really. But Miss Marple's expression softened into something politely receptive. Of course, my dear. The sooner we speak to him, the better. Inspector Cray entered, a man in his 40s with a square jaw and a look of someone used to being obeyed. He nodded to Clarissa, then turned to Miss Marple with a polite stiffness. Miss Marple, is it? I understand you were at the fete earlier. I'd like to know if you saw Mrs. Grant there at any time today. I did not, Miss Marple said. But I heard Mrs. Harcourt mention seeing her yesterday morning, and that she had made a remark about her curtains. The inspector's brows drew together slightly. Curtains? Miss Marple nodded. She was. Concerned with them, apparently. One might wonder why. Cray gave a non-committal grunt and consulted his notebook. I'm more interested in the fact that her nephew's fingerprints were on the drawing-room door, and the teacup next to the chair she was found in. He says he dropped in to see her. They quarreled about money, and he left. Seems he neglected to mention the quarrel when first questioned. That is unfortunate, Miss Marple said mildly. Quarrels can so easily be misinterpreted. Inspector closed his notebook with a snap. Well, the case seems straightforward enough, but I'll follow up on this curtain business. If you recall anything else, please let me know. After he had gone, Clarissa looked at Miss Marple with exasperation. You see? He's already decided. Miss Marple's fingers smoothed the edge of her handkerchief. Yes, which is often, when the truth slips away unnoticed. She said no more, but in her mind the image of a heavy curtain hem, perhaps concealing something small and important, began to form with greater clarity. Whispers on the green, By the time the Fates' bunting had begun to sag in the late afternoon sun, the murder, for that was the word now being used openly, had become the only topic of conversation in Marleycombe. It was as if the village's collective attention had been snatched away from sponge cakes and coconut shies and fixed firmly on the grim image of the old vicarage, with its shuttered drawing-room and the body inside. No one knew, or admitted to knowing, the exact details, but this only encouraged invention. Mrs. Perkins, flushed from the heat and from indignation that such a thing could happen in a respectable parish and on fete day of all days, claimed to have heard from her cousin's husband's sister that the victim was Mrs. Elspeth Grant, a widow of some years who lived alone in the old vicarage since the death of her brother, the former vicar. She was found slumped in an armchair, Mrs. Perkins whispered to an eager ring of listeners near the tea tent, with the curtains drawn, in the middle of the day, and there was a mark round her neck. She lowered her voice so that her next words could barely be caught. A stocking, they say. A gasp went up, whether from horror or from satisfaction at such a juicy detail was hard to tell. Near the bric-a-brac stall, two young women in matching sundresses were deep in their own theory. "It's obvious, isn't it?" one insisted. "That nephew of hers, what's his name? Paul something or other. He's always short of money. I bet he wanted the inheritance." Her companion nodded eagerly. Or maybe it was that companion. She had, what was she called? Miss Trent. They say she was dreadfully put upon. Over by the tombola table, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Lister, was attempting to restore some moral order. "We mustn't jump to conclusions," she said firmly, though her eyes darted about in the hope of catching further tidbits. "The police will handle it. We are not detectives." Miss Marple, seated quietly on a folding chair with her knitting in her lap, allowed the talk to swirl around her. She was neither part of the gossip nor entirely apart from it. Years of living in St. Mary Mead had taught her that people often revealed far more than they intended when they thought they were merely passing the time of day. And here, amid the tangle of rumor and invention, were small glimmers of things that might matter later. Mrs. Harcourt's remark about the curtain hem, Mrs. Perkins's emphasis on the drawn drapes, the curious absence of Miss Trent, who might have been expected to make some public show of distress. It was after 4 o'clock when Clarissa Harcourt at last appeared, sweeping across the grass in a summer dress patterned with roses. She came straight to Miss Marple and said in a low voice, "Jane, my dear, it is true. Poor Elspeth, strangled, and the police think they know who it is. Do they, indeed?" Miss Marple looked up mildly, as if hearing about an unusual new scone. "Recipe," Clarissa nodded. "The nephew. Inspector Cray says it's practically certain. There's something about him, apparently, and he was seen going into the vicarage earlier. They've taken him to the station already." Miss Marple's needles clicked twice before she answered. "One mustn't be too hasty, Clarissa. Things are so very rarely as simple as they appear." Clarissa gave a faint snort. "Well, I suppose you would say that." She glanced about. "Come along, we'll have some tea. Heaven knows I need it after all this." Miss Marple rose, following her friend, though her mind was far from tea. She was thinking of the quiet remark Clarissa had made earlier in the day, before the news broke, about Elspeth Grant fiddling with the hem of those dreadful heavy curtains. It was a small thing, but in Miss Marple's long experience, small things had a way of becoming the very heart of a matter. A summer's fete at Marleycombe. Bunting fluttered lazily in the breeze, its bright triangles casting little shadows across the green. It was the sort of warm, sun-drenched afternoon that village fetes in Marleycombe seemed to conjure almost on command, though in truth, half the parish committee had been anxiously watching the sky all morning in case the weather betrayed them. Children darted between the stalls, their shrieks of delight mingling with the steady thump of the coconut. Shy. The scent of fresh scones and strawberry jam drifted from the tea tent, where Mrs. Martha Perkins presided with the benevolent authority of a general overseeing a particularly crucial campaign. Near the bandstand, the Marleycombe Brass Ensemble gamely worked their way through Colonel Bogey, the tuba player looking as if he might expire from the heat before the final note. Miss Jane Marple, in a straw hat that had seen many such summer days, stood near the cake competition table, regarding the entries with quiet amusement. Her friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry had entered a Victoria sponge that looked as if it might win on appearance alone, though Miss Marple suspected its center might be a trifle too heavy. One learned these things after decades of listening to village gossip, where even the consistency of a sponge could spark opinionated debate. Marleycombe was not St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's own village, but she had been invited for this week by an old acquaintance, Mrs. Clarissa Harcourt, who lived at the Gables, a fine Georgian house just beyond the green. Clarissa had insisted that Miss Marple attend the fete, and so here she was, smiling politely as she accepted a paper plate with a wedge of seed cake from a kindly young woman. She did not know it was as she wandered towards the white marquee, where the local history society displayed sepia photographs of the village in 1890, that the first ripple of unease passed through the crowd. It began subtly, the sudden cessation of laughter in one corner, the way a mother called her child to her side with unnecessary sharpness, the brass band faltering in mid-bar as several heads turned towards the far end of the green. Miss Marple's eyes followed the direction of those glances. There, just beyond the edge of the green, where the churchyard wall curved into shadow, stood Inspector Gerald Cray of the Marleycombe Police. He was speaking in low, urgent tones to Constable Rowe, his brows drawn together in a manner that did not suggest an escaped sheep or a minor case of pilfering from the cake stall. Then came the whisper, passed from stall to stall like the first. Rumor of a storm. Someone's been found? In the old vicarage. The words reached Miss Marple in the voice of a middle-aged man in a straw boater, who seemed both shocked and pleased to be the bearer of dramatic news. Dead, they say? Right in the drawing-room. The curtains drawn in broad daylight. Queer business, that. Miss Marple's hand paused on her teacup. "Dear me," she murmured, her tone mild. "How very unfortunate." By now the crowd was restless. The cake judging had been abandoned. Mrs. Perkins looked as if she had half a mind to shoo everyone back to their stalls. But curiosity in a village is a force more powerful than any parish committee member, and already small knots of people were leaning together, exchanging fragments of what they'd heard. From the corner of her eye, Miss Marple saw Inspector Cray's gaze sweep the green, land on her for the briefest of moments, then move on. He had the look of a man weighed down by something unpleasant. She did not, of course, rush forward or press for details. One learned, in such situations, that information came more readily to those who waited and listened. Instead, she allowed herself to drift closer to Mrs. Harcourt's garden gate, where she knew Clarissa would be holding court with a group of friends. Clarissa's voice carried, as it always had, "And I think I saw her only yesterday. Quite. Well, though I will say she seemed a little distracted, fiddling with the hem of those dreadful heavy curtains." Miss Marple's ears sharpened. Curtains. Hem. A distracted woman. The details were small, the sort one might overlook if one were not in the habit of collecting them like a bird gathers twigs. She sipped her tea, her face serene, while in the quietest corner of her mind the first threads of a puzzle began to weave themselves together.